Today is Friday, November 17th, 2017, and this is Stephen Fagan, the curator at the Sixth Form Museum at Dealey Plaza. And the interview that we're doing today is part of the museum's ongoing oral history project. And sir, at the start of these, we always ask our guests to introduce themselves with their full name, date and place of birth, and just a little background about themselves.
Yes, I'm Michael Glenn Marcades, born in February 13th day, 1953. I'm the sole son of a woman that most of the world know as Rose Cherami. I know her as Melba Christine Youngblood Marcades. I'm a native Texan, somewhat well educated, went to school a lot. I have a PhD from Texas Tech. I've taught at Texas Tech. I'm a music educator, professional musician, professional conductor, now published author. I'm a father. Can't think of anything else.
That's fun. That's wonderful. Let's get a little biographical sketch of your mom as well. Tell me a little bit about her early life, when and where she was born.
Well, she was born obviously here in Texas, in East Texas, in Fairfield, Texas, which is farm country in the 40s, 30s, 20s, and she was born to a very meager family, tenant farmer. Thomas Jefferson Youngblood and Minnie Bell Youngblood, Minnie Bell Stroud Youngblood. She had two siblings, two sisters. She was in the middle. The dynamics in their household was very interesting between those three sisters. I grew up mostly not knowing her. She was not around by the time I was born. Her life was already troubled. Riddled with crime, drugs, arrests, incarcerations, etc. So discussion around our household was somewhat limited about her because I think of the pain that my family bore about their daughter, sadness, hurt about what they were dealing with their daughter. More about her? Stephen, what would you like me to do?
Most of the world probably knows her from the opening moments of Oliver Stone's film JFK. This very dramatic opening. This woman's pushed out of a car, no idea who she is, but she's talking about the president about to be assassinated before it happens. It's an extremely dramatic moment that I know millions of people around the world watch.
It is.
That's your mom. How do you feel about the world knowing her in that way?
Well, honestly, it has been difficult at times. To have your mom known as a heroin addict, prostitute, incarcerated in Angola prison by the time she was 19, is not easy to carry. But the choice I had was if I was going to actually get to know my mother as much as I could inside and out and understand the moment in time which you just referred to, where most of the world defines who she is, what she is, by those moments depicted in that film, then I had my work cut out for me. But as I said in my book, it is very odd for my mother to be known in that capacity and in that realm and in that level of criminal activity and behavior. It's very strange. Somebody just this past week, I was trying to explain to them a little bit about my book, and they had that raised eyebrow curiosity. And he looked at me and he said, "Your mother?" And I said, "Yes, my mom. Not my cousin, not a sister, not an aunt, not a grandmother, but my mother." And so I guess if I were to be truthful, I think when most people meet me, they're surprised that I am the son of Rose Cherami. And the story, which I have researched for 30 years, when I went back to school at the age of 42 to get my PhD, I learned how to research. And I had no clue how those skills were going to impact my life. I never planned to write a book about my mother. All I planned to do was know who she was as best as possible. Because on a personal level, even to this day, even to you talking to you right now. I'd give anything if I could see her, talk to her, hug her, feel her caress, which as her son. It's just something difficult to live without, and after I had my own children, it became a very clear picture from that standpoint.
Most of the authors and researchers that I speak to, I ask them the question, where does your passion for this come from? But I would imagine it's pretty obvious with you because you have a deeply personal connection that very few people can claim.
I do. As her son, I need to know as much truth as humanly possible. And that the truth that I needed to know was not going to be handed to me on a silver platter by anyone. There are people who are near and dear to me in the past 30 years with whom I've connected, including people like Gary Shaw. But I had no idea the day that I met Gary Shaw and Joe West. I had no idea how that would impact my life. For me, it was a visit in the home of my aunt and uncle in North Dallas, and I thought that would be it.
Let's take a step back to your childhood for just a moment, and we'll go chronologically and pick up the story of how you got involved in this. But give me your first childhood memories of President Kennedy, your memories of the day of the assassination.
I remember it vividly. 5th grade, Central Elementary School, Duncanville, Texas. Oddly, when the event occurred and it was announced across our old PA system into my classroom, I had left the classroom to go to the restroom. And so when I came back to the classroom, I remember Ms. Walker, my 5th grade teacher, to say that she was completely stunned. Was even I as a 5th grader knew that something was really wrong. All of my classmates were in somewhat of a state of shock, stir if it's possible for 5th graders to communicate that emotion, but nothing was right when I came back into the room. And I remember asking one of my classmates, what has happened? And obviously communicated with me that our president had been shot. And it was a serious moment. Even as a 5th grade child, I knew something serious had occurred. Life-changing, indeed. I believe we were all sent home, something that is pretty difficult to do in the middle of a school day, but life changed in that point. But I do remember it specifically. I remember watching newscasts. I remember watching Walter Cronkite like it was yesterday. I don't remember it from the YouTube. I remember watching it on the small television in our living room in black and white. And I remember the sound of his voice. I always think of Walter Cronkite kind of like the voice of America at that time. Very different than news today. Not a personality of the news, but Walter Cronkite was the voice of the news. I remember my family being in utter shock. Of course, there was no connection with my mother really at that point. Not for a couple of years later would there be any semblance of connection. And even then, I do remember my family, as much as they loved my mother, as sister, daughter, aunt, my first cousins adored my mother. This is an aspect that if you only consider Rose Cherami or Melba Christine Youngblood Marcades from the clip in the JFK film, you don't get any semblance of who the woman was. And one of my serious goals, once I made up my mind that I was going to finish the book, to finish my research, I wasn't going to finish the book, I was going to finish my research and organize it in a concise way and tell the story in a logical thread manner, which is very different than writing a dissertation. I remember when I first started trying to write this down, people who read my manuscripts said, Mike, this is not a dissertation. And I remember approaching the subject from a purely factual standpoint. And just like I was analyzing a Bach fugue, I would regurgitate all the mathematical links that I know to be present in Bach's literature, in the genius mind of Bach. And so when I started writing about this story, it was only natural for me to talk about it in that factual manner. But what I realized that I was missing was the story of my mother, not the facts, the story. And the perspective that I have, Stephen, is that I know the roads that my mother took to wind up, if you will, on that screen in that film. It is unbelievable to have a mother connected to a historical event of this magnitude, something that changed America, indeed, perhaps the world, forever. And then to discover all the sadnesses associated with her life, the manner in which she died, all the, what would you call it? All the factual statements, documents that contradict each other, that don't make any sense, that no one in my family seemed capable of digging into and trying to find out the final answers about them. For instance, DOA typed 3 times on the original death certificate, yet with the assistance of Gary and a lawyer, I was able to retrieve 20 pages of medical treatment given to my mother at Gladewater Hospital. She obviously was not dead on arrival. I mean, it's just hard to believe. Sitting here talking to you right now, I just had a flash in my mind that it's hard to believe that I'm actually connected to this. And the other side of this is it's miraculous that I'm alive.
You know, there's a harrowing story in the book that you recount of you as a baby, like in the corner of a room, and I mean, it's desolate and deeply disturbing. And to think that is you who is sitting here talking to me today with a PhD. It's a really remarkable journey that you've been on, considering what you describe in the book.
It is that event in my life, there is like a shadow of recall. And of course, this has all been reported to me by my family as long as I can remember. My maternal grandparents telling me, well, we rescued you. And as you know from what you've read in the book, the decision that my grandmother shared with my grandfather, God is telling me to get in the car, we got to get in the car, we got to go find Michael. Because they most of the time had no clue where mother was. And of course, once I was born, I had very little clue where I was located. I did bounce back and forth a lot from New Orleans to Houston in the home of my dad's mother on Veterans Boulevard in New Orleans, and of course with my maternal grandparents wherever they lived, either in Houston or East Texas or wherever, but mostly in Houston and then Duncanville in the Dallas area. But the story, you know, I think back about it, I don't think I could write that scene without having some kind of psychological connection with the moment. There are, you know, I hope that my emotions don't get the better of me talking. You have a lot of pain associated with the story.
I can imagine. Tell me a little bit about the memories you do have of your mom.
Yes, some of them are very sweet. Some of them are odd. There's not very many. There's about 3 or 4 instances that I truly remember. I remember her being with our family, a rare occasion that mother showed up to be with our family. And I remember us going to East Texas, a place called Sandy Lake, a place where families used to go picnic together. I remember that day quite vividly. You know, mother seemed normal. Maternal. Human in every sense of the word. You know, pictures that I have from that day, you would never look at those pictures and have any inkling at all the scenery from which that female removed herself to come experience that very normal American day on the side of a lake, sharing a picnic lunch with the family. I do remember being a very young boy, 5 years old, shortly after my grandparents rescued me from the situation that you just referred to, sharing an Easter Sunday with my mother. I remember standing under a tree in the front yard, taking a picture, standing by her. It's very strange to be posing for a picture with your mom and to not actually know her. And there were many moments when I was near her that I think that to say that I was scared or at least apprehensive is pretty genuine, pretty fair word to use. Because my grandparents had already told me many times, Mike, don't ever let mother take you. So once they claimed me from that horrific scene that you remember from my book, they were very protective of me. So that's two. One day, when we lived right outside of Duncanville before my aunts and uncles purchased a home for my grandparents inside the city limits of Duncanville, we lived kind of out in the country in a very small rent house. And literally, out of nowhere, a yellow cab pulled up in front of our house. And I remember the cab pulling up. I remember the rushing around of my grandparents. Their wayward daughter had once again arrived unannounced. And I remember seeing her get out of that cab, and I remember how beautiful she was. I admit that I was a little fearful at that moment. And I remember, if you remember from my relaying the story, I went to my small bedroom at the back of that little frame house. But I remember her hopping out of that cab, her blonde curls bouncing. She was stunningly beautiful, drop dead gorgeous. And my grandparents going out on the porch, left, I go to my bedroom. But that's about all I remember from that visit, other than her ironing underwear and ironing handkerchiefs and washing clothes. I don't even remember her departing that scene. I don't know when she left. Maybe I was asleep. Don't know. And then I remember her funeral, which was one of the most peculiar days of my entire life. I remember people who really cared for my family and cared for me and knew a little bit of the sad story about it, and putting their arms around me and telling me how hard it must be for me. And if the truth be known, I couldn't no more assemble my feelings that day than anything. I don't know what I felt. I certainly don't know that I felt the loss that I feel today. I'm fairly sure that that's true. Because what I feel today about the loss of her is far more intense now than it ever was when I was a young boy. And the older I became, the more clear that loss became. But the funeral was very quiet. Not very many people attended. Probably, I've thought back many times about that scene. 50, 60 people? Who knows? Most of those were family, some dear friends. And I remember gathering at Wheatland Cemetery, a place that I've visited numerous times now as a full-grown adult. Except that cemetery was out in the middle of nowhere then. Now it's surrounded by cement and buildings. But I do remember that day getting in the funeral family car, driving for miles down Wheatland Road, out Duncanville, to that very quiet little spot in the middle of the country to lay Mother to rest in the corner of that little cemetery. Those events that I just told you about, those are the only events that I truly recall. I mean, true recall. If I look at pictures from my infancy, my early infancy, either in New Orleans or elsewhere, there is that hint of memory. But it's had the photograph not shown up in front of my face, I would never have pulled it up. But I'm sure a psychologist could explain how those kinds of images can be embedded in your mind, and you only recall them once you see the photograph.
When did you first become aware of the Kennedy assassination connection?
The day I met Gary Shaw and Joe West in my aunt and uncle's home in North Dallas, Morris and Moselle Wall. Those gentlemen came to, actually I got a phone call from my aunt telling me that some man, of course they had no real clue who Gary Shaw or Joe West was and what they were connected to. They said, Mike, somebody has called and they have some information about your mother. Can you please come home for a while? And so we, picked a day, picked a time, and I dutifully showed up at my aunt and uncle's home. And I do remember vividly at that house on High Vista Drive in Dallas how odd that moment was, because my aunt and uncle were just as stunned as I with the information that was shared about Mother's remote connection with the Kennedy assassination, her foreknowledge of that historic event, the probability of murder being involved in her death. All of that was very, very shocking to us. And as far as I can remember, my aunt and uncle were terrified by what they were being told that day, and their first mode of defense was rejection. It's about the only way I think they probably survived Mother's life, most of their life, was to, once they've heard something, it was to let it go, forget it, move on. It was just their way of defending themselves in what I now understand as at least 25 years of major pain from my mother. When she left home for the first time around 14, following a very interesting case of encephalitis. You asked me a few minutes ago, what do I think people think about when they see that film clip? Well, they certainly don't know any of this. They certainly don't know about a child experiencing encephalitis and being hospitalized for almost 30 days, and the ravaging nature of fever, brain swelling, the warning of a physician to my grandparents to watch out for unusual changes once my mother began to go through puberty, and that there was no telling how that extreme case of encephalitis can impact her psychological makeup and responses. In fact, they were warned to keep my mother away from alcohol and, of course, keep her away from drugs. I just find that, even now when I think back to that time period, it's odd for me to think about people being worried about drugs. I mean, the ravages of drugs seems like a very contemporary reality, at least in 2017. I mean, from the 60s forward. But evidently drugs have always been around and always adversely impacted the lives of people. Drinking alcohol was death to my mom.
Now, other than family stories, how do you go about researching a life that is that restless, with so much moving around, such a lifestyle?
Well, something odd happened to me when my grandparents died. My aunt, Mo, handed me a grocery sack full of documents, pictures, and I had no clue that grocery sack full of items would become the foundation for my research. It truly, just like my dissertation that I did related to my doctorate, there is nothing there until you start researching and validating and making a case for and discovering and connecting dots. And that's precisely what I did. From birth, family life, leaving home, coming back, leaving home again, staying gone, criminal records, yes, family stories that were very important. And then I had a lot of documents handed to me. Oddly, the older I became, there were individuals who actually tracked me down and put things in my hands. But before that, in that grocery sack was Mother's death certificate, a variety of other things that sometimes I wonder if my family even looked at. And if they did look at it, how could they not respond? And at the risk of being redundant, my only guess is their pain was so deep that they just did not have the heart to find answers. But I, as her son, I didn't have enough answers. I didn't even know this person. And once anything questionable was attached to her death, I don't think I ever was able to let it go. And the research, one piece of research would turn up this question and this answer and this question and this answer. And then even if I went back to family and asked them, their general response is, Mike, we need to let this go. And so I really did this continued research on my own without an encouragement of any family members to find out some hard answers. So
a lot of the book reads like a novel. You obviously take a little artistic license in constructing scenes and dialogue and things like that. Give me a sense of where the research stops and where your conjecture, your storytelling begins.
Well, that's a very interesting question. My research is deep. And when you research on that level, it's not difficult to come up with the scenario. If you add the importance of family tales that were consistent over time, stories from my cousins coupled with research, finding my father. I mean, there was also that connection. Everything about the New Orleans scene was confirmed, through dialogue with my father and my 3 half-brothers. So how do I come up with it? I think true research breeds that kind of vision. Right now, I'm remembering what it was like to do research for my dissertation on some music by Benjamin Britten that ironically wound up staying in America. Britten, not to get taste of rabbit, Britten comes to America as a conscientious objector, continues to compose music while he's here. By the way, he's one of only 4 or 5 great composers to ever come out of England in all of history. And so when World War II starts up, America gets involved, Britain elects to go back to England. Everything that he had in his possession as far as artistic creation was confiscated by customs. Oddly, those documents stayed in the hands of a German family here in America. Not until Benjamin Britten's partner in life dies do those documents get sent to England. Now we're talking about sometime in the 80s when this music was composed 40 years earlier. And no one has ever performed it, no one has analyzed it, no one's seen it in any way, in a limited way. And so when I began my connection with that music, there is a point to my story. When I began my connection with that music that no one knew about, everything that I learned and presented as part of my dissertation, I had to discover through serious research. And once you go down that path of discovery, it's not hard to make your case. Though it might take, I do remember the arduous task of making the case for a point about that music. It's just like doing research on my mother and the scene that you referred to earlier. Once you've heard it relayed to you and once you have researched and gone on site to locations where people lived in those conditions, it's not hard to create them. But like I told you earlier, telling Mother's story in a dissertation-like manner would have done very little good. And the book that you have on your table beside you is my 4th rewrite. I researched for 30 years, I wrote for 10, and rewrote the book 4 times. And the last time that I walked through it, God sent me a gift, Norma Kirkpatrick. Norma Kirkpatrick was an older lady brilliant lady who showed up in my church choir room in Alabama, in Opelika, Alabama. And during prayer times at the end of rehearsals, while I was doing all this research and struggling, I would tell little snippets of Mother's story and use it as hopefully a point to better their lives and get them to believe in the importance of trusting God and God's care and provision for all of us. One night, Norma came up to me and said, "We've got to get together." And by the time I met Norma, I had a full manuscript in my hand. And the thing that you just referred to was what was missing was the ability to tell the story in a way that, in a novel-like concept. So God sent me Norma to help focus that story in a way that people could read. Because if I were to hand you my dissertation today, page 4, you go, "Oh, thanks a lot, I think I'm done." But the way that book is constructed, Norma and I spent thousands of hours writing, rewriting, envisioning, selecting verbiage that would communicate Mother's story. I'm so, I guess proud of it is a good word. I'm proud to have finished, to have provided a complete story available for those who want to know how the woman on that screen of Oliver Stone's film wound up there. How does a person get there? And more importantly, how does a person end up on the side of a lonesome road? In my mind, murdered and covered up for 50 years.
The eyewitness accounts who heard her tell that story of the forewarning of the assassination, and the stories also about Ruby and Oswald. And as you know, there are issues with those accounts, the inconsistencies between 1967 stories and then stories before the House Select Committee. How did you navigate that and make determinations about what was true and what was not?
Very carefully. I think that I'd be lying to you if I told you I knew every absolute truth about Mother's life, but I know a lot of them. And in places where I was unable to make determination, I think smart people figure out at what point their expertise stops and at what point they need to confer with persons who have much greater knowledge about incidents, specific realities, descriptions, facts that contradict each other. And I took advantage of that. People like Gary Shaw. I keep mentioning Gary Shaw because I trust him. I mean, he's one of the most heralded first-generation researchers. Why would Gary Shaw tell me something about my mother that he did not wholeheartedly believe to be true or 99% probable?
What year did you meet Gary?
We met in the 80s. Gary and I have talked about this, and there's a little discrepancy about exactly when that was, but I have so much respect for Gary, I go, okay, I'll take your date and time. I was a young adult, and it's hard to remember. Some things weren't exactly that important at that time, but.
Let me ask you this. Were you a believer in the story from the beginning? Were you incredulous and then came to believe it? Do you have doubts today? Give me a little bit of your process there.
That's a really interesting question. Let me think about it a moment.
Sure.
I think that what I knew was that something was wrong. The day that I finally acquired the medical reports from Gladewater Hospital, which, by the way, was no small task. And if I hadn't had Gary Shaw and a lawyer with me, it would not have happened. And by the way, my mother's records were not in a file cabinet. They were behind a desk. And once I put that document and the hour by hour, minute by minute description of what medical care was given. I mean, even the most simple person in the world can look at a death certificate that says DOA and put the medical documents beside that accounts for care for over 8 hours and go, wait a minute, something's not right. I mean, even the most simple person understands that DOA means dead on arrival, and that a 20-page medical document means you weren't dead on arrival. And if you add that with transcript of discussion with Jerry Don Moore, whom my family probably attacked, looking for a villain in this situation. Everything that he did, where he took the document, the way he has relayed the story of taking my mother to a physician out in the middle of nowhere, placing her on the front. I mean, all of this is not made up. And then getting her to a hospital. I mean, so you ask me, how did I come to the point? How do I know? The contradictions helped me question. And today, November 2017, I'm as sure as any human can be, after conferring with physicians about verbiage, vocabulary, phrasing, medicines given to my mother, the timing of all of it, but assembling all of it, I'm as certain today as I humanly can be that something wrong happened on the side of that dark road in East Texas, outside of Gladewater, Texas. And that what happened to her on the side of a road, as depicted at JFK, outside of Eunice, was something odd and wrong as well. But by that time, it was not unusual for my mother to be with the wrong people. She made a life of being with the wrong people at the wrong time. And once she started down that road, I don't think she had a clue about how to get off. If she ever had the desire to get off of that horrific treadmill, I don't think she thought she could. And if you add her addictions to that, and probably the way those addictions were probably used against her to maintain control of her, I'm not sure that she had a hope. But am I fairly comfortable with what I believe about what happened to my mother? Yes. All the way back to the point of growing up in a difficult household, in a time when children were property. Discipline was severe. Oddity of behavior was not met as it is today, as in trying to figure out some kind of psychological label and some kind of accommodation to bring out the best in that individual. The control of children, that they behave well, was the goal. In my mother's childhood, you either did what you were told or you didn't, or you suffered the consequences. I mean, it's a huge ball of factual data for me to assimilate. What disappoints me most is that my family didn't have the courage to find out the answers when some of those answers could have been more easily obtained. I mean, all I had done is research and found documents missing, autopsy report never shared with our family, contradictory evidence in a medical report and a death certificate, stories from my dad telling me about how difficult mother was to deal with, how she was almost impossible to control, yet she was stunningly beautiful and captivating on stage in Bourbon Street at the Blue Angel. I mean, how did I get to that story? Evolution and help. Norma and I are forever joined, because I'm not really sure that a man could tell this story without the assistance of a female. It's funny, I was talking with a friend earlier today about how our wives converse together in ways that we can never talk to them. And that the substitution of me at the table with his wife doesn't work. I mean, there is a conversation there, but it's nothing like the conversation between our two wives. That's what Norma Kirkpatrick helped me see. I'm not a female.
How have people responded to the book?
Oh, wow. In tears, changed, relieved, amazed, helped, healed. I mean, actually, I've had people come into my office of employment in tears after reading my book.
What about the research community? They're a far more critical audience typically. What have they said?
Well, let me say this. I have not been attacked. Am I telling the truth? I have not been attacked. I expected to be attacked. I have not been. I have not been attacked. Now that tells me something, because I've lived in this world long enough that if you put something out there, you can fully expect to be criticized. If I have been criticized, it's not been anything huge. It's not been anything that's been overwhelming. It hasn't even come directly to me. And we all know how easy it is to find somebody. There's not been any articles written about the absurdity of the nature of the book, about its flow, its content. Every word, my publisher was absolutely insistent that every sentence that I write had to be backed up with a document, because she knew that the assassination community would tear it apart were it not backed up by documentation. Oddly, my grocery sack was full of documentation. Things that I didn't even pay attention to for a very long time. I'm still being invited to speak about the book. The book has sold around the world. It has been reviewed highly in the world of Amazon, whatever that means. Although, nobody has to say anything good on Amazon. You can say whatever the heck you want to about what I've written on Amazon. Nobody will even know where you are. They'll never even be able to track you down. If you go research the reviews that have occurred on Amazon, you'll be stunned at what's there. I'm stunned. Recently, I was really taken by a very short review that showed up on that site. It said, "I knew her. She was my idol. I loved her, and then they murdered her." You asked me, how has this book impacted people? Deeply.
Have you tried to reach out to this person?
I believe there's some kind of identification firewall behind that kind of reality. I mean, I've asked friends to help me figure out who that is. I sent an immediate response to that person saying, "Here I am, please contact me." I don't think it's probably far-fetched. I'm stunned by the words. Are you not?
It's very interesting.
I mean,
not something you would expect to turn up in a book review.
No. So how has it impacted people? I'm sure that somebody thinks it's ridiculous. I know that it's solidly researched, carefully written, and written, and written, and written again.
Well, let me ask you this then. It's been 30 years of your life in pursuit of this. You might call it an obsession. It's done. The book is done. You're talking about it. Where do you go from here now?
Hopefully towards some sense of peace. My own children don't even understand this. My own children, you used the word obsession. Yes, I was obsessed in knowing my mother, not in writing a book. And every sentence, every chapter that was conceived and rewritten and reanalyzed and rewritten again, I took one step closer to her. You know, at 64 years of age, I'm still deeply moved by her absence. It has not gotten easier. Every ounce of Discover has made it harder in many ways. But I had to find as many answers as I possibly could. I simply could not live my life, in my life, and not have more answers. And someday, when my children want to know who their grandmother is, that will be there. And it won't be only relying on the clip from Oliver Stone's JFK. You know, it's my understanding that most people thought that Oliver Stone made up that character. That it just in his unbelievable mind that he created this female. And many people I think have been stunned by the fact that it was a real person. Not just a person isolated in that moment in time, but she was a sister. She was a daughter. She was someone's mother. She was someone's wife. In fact, she was the wife of 2 or 3 men. That my family, you know, yes, my father, but others. I mean, I've even tried to figure out, well, Michael Glenn Marcades. Michael. You know, all of my children's names are connected to something. You know, maybe it was a name I saw on the television screen. Well, I like that. Let's use that name. Michael. There are no immediate people. There's nobody in my family named Michael. There's certainly not a Glenn with 2 N's. Mothers don't just make up names like that. Mothers bring up and assign names with meaning and connection to their past or their present or something, or someone else's past or present who's dear to them.
What's it like for you to be here in Dealey Plaza, inside the depository building right now?
That's strange that you asked me that question. Because when I drove into town today, I drove right by here on my way to the office. It's like a shudder. I have like a mental shudder. You know, and I look over at the spot where a person was murdered in broad daylight. And you can argue how he was murdered, but the one fact that remains is that he was murdered. He was removed from existence. He was shot in the middle of Dallas, Texas, in Dealey Plaza. We can argue till God comes about whether it came from the grassy knoll or the book depository or from the freeway or from behind the freeway and over. The point was, our president died brutally, seated beside his wife. I just can't imagine.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you? Any other stories or avenues we haven't explored yet that you want to talk about?
I have considered every possible realm of getting answers, even to the point of exhumation. And I just have never gotten to the point of doing that, because I know if I exhume that body, I will get some answers about punctate stellate. Metal doesn't fade. Body goes to dust. Metal remains. And, you know, people who are near and dear to me and have asked me, and what will that accomplish? What more would be done? You know, and what do you really want that circus surrounding your mother? So you asked what have we not talked about. I've never mentioned the possibility of exhumation to anybody in public, mentioning it only to my dearest, closest friends or colleagues about it, you know, the subject, related to the subject. But I have some disappointment that my family doesn't stand with me really today in this quest, in this entire learning process. My wife, my precious Kelly, has encouraged me. I probably would not have finished this project if it weren't for her love and her care and encouragement. Not to finish a book, but to just finish the road of discovery as much as possible. Have I missed something? I'm sure. But I've gotten a lot of it. You haven't asked me about, if you did, what it feels like to be her son. It feels surreal. There's nothing about my mother's life that is normal about motherhood. I can't name one thing. I mean, what mother leaves her 4-year-old unattended in a filthy, roach-infested apartment? I mean, that's not normal. So, but I will say this. There is a silver lining to all of this. My mother's absence was the ultimate offer of love toward me. And most people don't define absence as the definition of love. But I believe that my mother knew that the clientele with whom she was associated would have never thought twice about harming me if they thought they could get something else out of her. You know, and at one point in my research, somebody in writing referred to mother's demise as nothing more than somebody taking out the trash. That the assignment for the day was to throw away the trash, and that the trash happened to be a human being who had been used and was done for. You know, my mother was a piece of work. There was no shutting up my mother. When she was going to speak, she was going to speak. And my guess is she had used up her usefulness, and that somebody was worried about what might come out of her mouth, and so she was taken out. And I really have a lot of sadness in my mind about Jerry Dunmore. Jerry Dunmore did not kill my mother. I don't believe Jerry Dunmore even hit my mother. There was no blood, no hair, no skin found under his vehicle after close scrutinization. There were tread marks on my mother's left forearm. Jerry Dunmore's tires had no tread. None. Or brakes. You know, so there's a lot of peripheral thoughts about this whole story. You know, and I'm a Christian. I'm an ordained minister. I believe in Jesus Christ. And I believe that someday I'll see my mother. You know, there's a story that I'll never forget my grandmother telling me this story. Near mother's the end of her life. Mother made a phone call to my grandmother. We called her Mama. And my grandmother has relayed this story. She said that she remembers talking to her daughter, and on the other end of the phone, my mother said, "You know, I know you don't believe it, but when you go to heaven, when you're standing outside the gates, so I want you to glance back over your shoulder. And way down at the end of the line, you're going to see some strawberry blonde girls." You know, I don't understand the afterlife. I just hope that at some point in time, that if I look up and go to heaven, that I'll have a chance to rejoin with my mom and see her there. You You know, there's not a lot in the Bible that supports that theological stance. But in my heart of hearts, I hope that's reality. And as her son, there's a part of me that hopes there is some connection from her to where I am. And that in some way, that she's proud of who I am. You know, I'll never forget. If you've read Gary Shaw's foreword, you remember he talks about the first day he met me and how he just was dumbfounded. This can't be Rose Cherami's son. And I'm not heralding myself. I'm just saying that God is good.
All right. Thank you so much for being part of this. We really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.